All right. Thank you for joining me, and thank you for being here again to what we watched last week. I'm Casey. These are not necessarily a series of reviews, more meant to be a bunch of discussions, really, about what we watched last week. Movies, TV, YouTube here and there. We're going into the last week of April here, starting with World War Z. And it's been years since seeing this originally in theaters, and I distinctly remember not being particularly wild the first time I saw it. Boy, am I happy I revisited this time around. Doing its own thing entirely from the book, for better or worse, we follow the Vanisher from Deadpool 2 as he navigates zombies, keeping his family safe throughout the first act, and then hunting down the cure throughout the second two acts. The story does an excellent job at showing how observant the Vanisher's character is throughout, as well as the general panic and anxiety throughout. This feels like a truly post 9/11 zombie movie. As much as I loved it on the rewatch, I must admit I still don't love the CGI zombie waves. I think that concept works much better in a more confined space, maybe a train, maybe going to Busan. And I've never loved that the world in this movie is entirely saved by one person. It feels a little superhero-y, but that didn't stop this from being a genuinely terrifying and enjoyable action movie this time around for me. Last Sunday we watched quite a bit because we also put on Superman Man of Tomorrow, DC animated movie. It kicked off this big DC animated universe we have going on. I think that just ended with Crisis on Infinite Earths Part 2. But this is a straightforward yet contemporary take on the adventures of Clark Kent that crams in as many recognizable characters as it can, while being alien and foreign, with excellent counterpoints on the subject with Lobo and the Martian Manhunter and the Parasite, who I know isn't an alien, but that is kind of the point of the movie here. The plot, the characters, and the writing really suck me in here, working in a lot of points and character mixes that I have never seen or expected or knew that I wanted before now. Superman does really well versus a kaiju as far as a final fight goes, but something about whatever technique DC animation is using in this era just isn't doing it for me, and it shows most in that animation. It lacks any real depth visually. Everything feels like it's been colored by 6th graders with Crayola markers or something. Man of Tomorrow is maybe my favorite Superman story put to film, with some animation that almost takes me out, but not quite, but I'm still more than happy this is a thing that exists. Holy crap, this is a great movie. 1958's The Vikings, an epic saga presented with all that classic Hollywood flair, almost swashbuckling in its feel between the themes and performances. The Vikings pushes Kirk Douglas as the lead, which he is, but we equally follow his slave and that slave's history, and we get a big, historically inaccurate, partial retelling of the legendary Viking Ragnar Lothbrok, as portrayed by Mermaid Man, with a whole lot of Shakespearean shenanigans thrown in, so we can have a dramatic plot about Ragnar's son. This feels like over-bloated Oscar bait that never paid off, and looking back on its legacy, that seems pretty accurate. Despite being overwritten and arguably overacted, there is still a lot of interesting moments and exciting sequences to be of substance here. This is like an old fancy chain restaurant that has lost all its prestige, but you can still take your dad there, he's gonna love it. When Worlds Collide. This is a unique space-based end-of-the-world disaster story from a time before when humanity really understood space. When Worlds Collide doesn't also have the technical know-how to live up to its title, but makes up for it with some solid character works and moral dilemmas unique to its situation and plot. Following a general everyday man who learns pretty early on about the end of the world by happenstance and becomes friends with the people in position to help him survive. The best points in this production for me were all about the fact that the main character and his moral struggle with whether he is useful or not and should go on this adventure and go on this arc to a new world. It's a really interesting conflict that I like. I don't see it a lot with, especially through the eyes of a protagonist. When Worlds Collide definitely had some solid sequences of the world falling apart and the disaster striking, but the production puts far more focus on the time before and after the disaster, putting its budget and its final escape sequences and a few rooms that shake to simulate earthquakes. A particularly interesting take on a story that's not dissimilar to more contemporaries like Armageddon and Deep Impact, I would say. Now, I don't think I've watched this since my parents brought home the old plastic clamshell VHS box and we put it on the once and then shoved it under our storage ottoman. I definitely watched this growing up because I definitely remember it, and that says something, because I don't remember everything I watch. This is a memorable experience, watching our orphan Mr. Dinosaur get adopted by apes and has to fight a grumpy leader, plus some non-verbal carnivores thrown in. It's the first half of Tarzan. Wait, it is the first half of Tarzan, plus The Land Before Time. Done really well, because I've seen all these characters before in years of tropes. The ones that ended up standing out ended up being the side characters for me. The elderly dinosaurs are really what brought me into this Disney picture. It would have been great to add one more element just to make this stand out from The Land Before Time. And may I throw out maybe just letting the Carnotaurus talk, give them personalities, and then you have two villains that are far better than, legally distinct Kerchak. And it might just be me, but I've always found the titular dinosaur design particularly generic. But maybe I just don't like the iguanodon. Scotland, PA. Now, I expected Macbeth in a McDonald's, and I got that, but I also got so much more. So many more awkward line readings, so many more off-kiltered moments than I could have ever expected in the 15 years I've had this on my watch list. And it really is a straightforward adaptation of Shakespeare's Macbeth. Most of the characters keep their namesakes, except instead of medieval Scotland castles, we're in Midwest Pennsylvania burger restaurants. It's funny in that awkward way, similar to The Room, but it feels a little more intentional than that, sometimes to its detriment as it struggles to find itself in the first act a bit, between the soundtrack that undercuts the comedy and the plot naturally having this gradual build. The start of this movie is a little slow. Once it got moving, though, I had some of the most fun I've ever had with Shakespeare, period, and with some of the most real and hilarious line readings I've ever heard. Civil War. In the final days of a fictitious civil war, a pair of journalists adopt an intern and plan to infiltrate and interview the most guarded man in the country, Nick Offerman, road tripping from skirmish to skirmish and war crime to war crime along their way. Alex Garland is not subtle in his messages and themes, as our lead character gives a really well-crafted explanation of the horrors of war, while our point-of-view character gradually loses their humanity until they are quite literally taking the place of our main character. We are perpetuating a cycle that is explicitly not broken by the end of the picture, and that's clear and present and great. In the weeks since this initial release, the most complaints I've seen were directed at the movie's lack of subtlety, but I don't think I've ever seen an anti-war movie that's been subtle. I don't think I've seen a war movie that's ever been subtle. Have you? What does a subtle war movie look like? But I think this lack of subtlety is balanced by the fact that not once does Garland talk down to his audience. And after sleeping on the picture for a few days, the only thing I still feel like complaining about is that our POV character goes from throwing up in the back seat to being out in the front lines as an overly brazen badass a little too quick. Yeah, her character development got a little speed out. Woe is me. I loved it otherwise. And Infested. Now, I got to put this on Shudder. It popped up on my feed. I'm not sure if it was new this week. It seems to have come out in 2023 in France. One act of solid setup, explaining how we get super spiders where they shouldn't be. A second act of rising action. The protagonist realizing how particularly substantially fucked they are. And a third act of how the fucked can we scare the shit out of the audience with spiders in as many ways possible. I would say the entire cast delivers from beginning to end, side characters including selling better than most that they are being covered in high to mid-quality CGI spiders. While the actual infestation goes from 0 to 20 to 100 really quick. That aside, special shout out to the spider hallway scene, because that was a great little sequence of tension, really built well. In its entirety, this is certainly a spider creature feature film, executed particularly well. I would argue better than most. Obviously, we have a huge trigger warning to anyone with an aversion to cuteness, because there are a bunch of cute spiders everywhere. And we are continuing our little journey with Doctor Who and the Aztecs. Still missing the mark of contemporary England, this time we land in the center of an Aztec temple. Barbara takes the episode's spotlight when she claims to be a goddess, walking the line between her desires, who doesn't want to be a god, and her good nature of not wanting anybody to just be sacrificed and murdered. Ian pretty much tries and fails the entire story to avoid a dick measuring contest, and the Doctor putzes around trying to get back to the TARDIS, which they are locked away from, while doing an old people flirt and sabotaging Ian's efforts. All of this goes on while Susan, who's been my favorite character, doesn't really have a lot to do, so she just kind of sits in the background. And after watching this, I do understand why this story sometimes gets promoted as a good introduction to the first Doctor. He's far less abrasive in any of the previous stories. And between his concern at the timelines and all the ethics discussions we have going on and his tinkering, it definitely feels the most like the Doctor has ever been thus far. It's also great to see Barbara being a little bit flawed and the characters being a little bit flawed altogether in their humanity. It adds depth to the character without taking away her kindness whatsoever. I think they did a really good job with Barbara here. On the episode villains, the most British Aztecs you have ever seen are pretty active in both being shits and getting one over on our protags. So, I remember not particularly loving this first story when I watched it years ago, but it's really grown on me since. And Paramount Plus released Knuckles this weekend, Friday, all 6 episodes in its entirety, so we can do a whole binge watch, just like it's 2015 again. It's really nostalgic to see a side character like Wade from the first 2 movies get a little spot to shine. Giving the sidekick a spinoff feels like something we aren't getting as much as we used to, but I could be wrong. After a brief series introduction to get our Sonics and Tails appearances checked off, and the titular Knuckles has an entirely random magic vision, he takes human doofus Wade Whipple on a road trip to bowl against his long-since abandoned him father. And it's Knuckles. This show is just a mashup between the road trip plot from the first Sonic the Hedgehog movie and the comedy of 2004's Dodgeball, a true underdog story, going so far as to explicitly take place in the same universe here. It's great. This feels like a natural progression from 2022 Sonic the Hedgehog 2 as well, like all across the board, except for maybe the production value a little is, the budget's a little lower. There are a few moments where Knuckles' CGI felt a little more floaty as Chief Bongo's dubbing didn't always seem to really match his lip movements. All in all, I felt like this was some generally harmless fun that knows how dumb it is and, embraces how dumb it is. I like that it embraces how dumb it is. And that's kind of all we watched last week. I think I'm going to go back and finish Dawn of the Planet of the Apes right now. Nothing particularly out there. I've got a cat with me today who's not happy I just grabbed him off the bed. Oh. But he's a good boyo. When did I lose focus? The lip flaps.